And welcome to our Green Leasing and LL97 webinar today. We're so glad you could join us. I'm Lisa Grayson. I'm the Deputy Manager of the New York City Accelerator, and I will be moderating the session today. In addition to our esteemed panelists, we also will have additional New York City Accelerator team members on the calls to answer your questions in the Q&A and/or live, depending on time. Please use the question and answer feature to share your questions throughout the webinar. We'll also be taking a few questions for each presenter, again, time permitting. We are recording the session, and we'll also make the PowerPoints available following. So please don't hesitate to also let us know if you'd like to have one of our account managers reach out to you and to work with you to provide a deeper dive into your buildings or portfolios compliance questions. So without further ado, let's take a look at the agenda today that we'll be covering. So I will start with an LL97 intro and overview, and that will be followed by the Green Lease Leaders Program overview that Diana Lee will provide, followed by the legal framework for green leasing that will be provided by Phyllis Kessler. And then we'll have a little bit of a panel dialogue with Emily and Lauren from SL Green and Bernardo talking about their company's journey with green leasing. So we'll again be taking questions throughout, and we'll have a good open discussion at the end. So again, to run through our panelists. So again, I'm Lisa Grayson, Deputy Manager of the New York City Accelerator. We have Diana Lee, Associate Director of Business Engagement for the Institute for Market Transformation. Phyllis Kessler, attorney with Greenbaum, Rowe, Smith & Davis. Lauren Moss, who's Senior Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer for Bernardo Realty Trust, and Emily Kildall, Vice President, Director of Sustainability at SL Green. So just to dive into an overview of LL97, I'm sure a lot of you are all very aware of LL97, so I'll keep this high level. For those of you who may not be, again, our account managers are here to help you understand your compliance requirements and help you navigate your building or portfolio's requirements as you move forward. So as we probably already know now that 70% of New York City's emissions come from buildings. And of these buildings, 90% of them will still be here in 2050. So it's imperative that we really focus on carbon reductions in buildings if we want to meet our the city's ultimate carbon reduction goals. The city has the largest climate solution legal framework put forth by any city in the world. It consists of a slate of climate laws designed to dramatically reduce carbon, and we have one of the first of its kind laws placing emission limits on buildings in New York City. So as you can see, we've got a slew of laws that have been put in place over the years. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with benchmarking, which is LL84. LL87 includes the energy audits and retro commissioning requirements. LL88 covers lighting and submetering. And then we move into some of the other newer laws that were instated as part of the Climate Mobilization Act that include LL33, which is the posting of the energy grades, incorporation of green roofs and solar with LL92 and 94. PACE financing, which rolled out in the last few years. PACE financing is available both for new and existing buildings. And of course, LL97 requiring emission limits on all buildings greater than 25,000 square feet. And LL154 applies primarily to new buildings requiring full electrification. Within local law 97, there are two pathways, one for market rate and one for affordable. I'm not really going to dive into these, but depending on the building type, there are different pathways to compliance. And again, we're happy to help navigate your journey through these pathways. So as you can see here, and are probably already very aware that the emission limits will start to ratchet down over the next 25 years, and they're going to go down in increments of 5 years. So as we know, we're at our first reporting period in the 2030 to 2034 period. The limits will ratchet again down in 2035. So again, it's never too early, even if you're not facing penalties at this point, to start thinking about those plans and understanding where you need to be and start budgeting, planning, and starting work to electrify your buildings. There are also ways to comply with LL97 by meeting emission limits or extending your time frame to comply with a good faith effort. And again, we won't go into a lot of detail on this today, but there are options to ensure that you can comply and that we can help you devise a plan that will get you on the path to compliance. So just a little bit about the New York City Accelerator. We are here as a free resource, 2 buildings across the city to help them meet compliance, reduce energy use, reduce emissions. As I said, we provide free technical guidance. We help identify upgrades in your building. We connect you with service providers, financing options. We're the dot connectors, the facilitators, the trusted Sherpa throughout this journey. So again, come to us. We can get you going, or if you get stuck along the way, help navigate options for you to pursue. Basically, all buildings that are greater than 5,000 square feet and that are privately owned are eligible to take advantage of our services. It's very easy just to get connected with us. Just reach out however you like, through our web, through email, through a phone call. We'll connect you with a dedicated account manager who is assigned to you based on your building type and sector. There's no cost, there's no catch or commitment. You can use us as little or as much as you would like. We are here to help you through this process. So the process, just quickly, once you connect with us, we will do an assessment either of your building or your portfolio so that we can help you prioritize what buildings or projects you may need to address first. We identify those ECMs or energy conservation measures, put you through, depending on your building size and complexity, we may recommend an energy audit. Once that audit comes back, or if we decide not, if you decide not to have an audit, start to look at those projects, those ECMs, and we'll can refer you to our list of service providers who provide these services. We are vendor agnostic, so it's up to you to choose who you'd like to work with. We'll also make sure that you're aware of all the incentives that are available from the utilities and state. We also have a list of tax and credits and tax credits and deductions that may be available depending on your projects. We'll help you through the procurement process, and again, just here to help make sure those projects are moving. As I mentioned, we have a service provider program. It can be used to identify providers based on any keywords. So if you're looking for lighting, if you're looking for heat pumps, if you're looking for RDPs, registered design professionals, just plug it into the lookup tool. It will produce a list of those companies. Also in this lookup tool, you can email directly to a service provider that you see that displays. And there are also a whole set of templates for request for proposals. So again, you may not know what you need to ask. That's the reason we've created these templates. So it's easy for you to reach out and request proposals from our array of service providers. We have quite a few service provider categories. We're continuing to add them all the time. If you are a service provider and not part of our network, please reach out and we'll walk you through the onboarding process. I've highlighted here that we do have registered design professionals. These people are critical to your LL97 submissions. It's going to be critical that if you are going to request any kinds of extensions or adjustments, that you have your design RDP on board by February 1st. So only a few days left. So again, I'm trying to keep this short, but please reach out to our team if you have questions or need assistance. We are here to help. And I will move on to Diana. You can take it from here. And thanks, everybody. I will start sharing, yep, and then you can take over the screen.
Thank you, Lisa. Just give me 1 second to pull the slides up. Okay, everyone looking good?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again, Lisa, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm thrilled to be here and to talk about green leasing and green lease leaders. My name is Diana Lee. I am the Associate Director of Business Engagement at IMT, or Institute for Market Transformation. We are a national nonprofit based in DC, and our mission is to decarbonize the built environment. So we do this through 3 main prongs of work: policy work, engaging with frontline communities to ensure that their voices are heard in policy decision-making processes, and connecting with businesses. So in my role, I fall squarely under this 3rd category. I lead our green leasing work and run our Green Lease Leaders program, which we'll talk about in this presentation. Here's a quick agenda for our time together. We'll go over some challenges with traditional leases, green leasing and how it relates to Local Law 97 in particular, green lease leaders, and I also wanted to share a few resources that you may find helpful. So before we talk about green leases, we need to talk about challenges with the traditional lease. Why is this even around? So with Local Law 97, landlords are on the hook for compliance, but tenants control the majority of energy use, up to 70 or even 100% in some cases. So this means that the landlord cannot decarbonize meaningfully without the tenant's collaboration. But how does this misalignment relate to a lease? So in a typical lease structure, there's this mismatch between who pays and who benefits for investing in efficiency projects. So if I'm a landlord, I'm responsible for upfront capital investments. But if I invest in, say, energy efficient building equipment, the tenant tends to be the one who sees the direct savings in the form of lowered energy bills. So since I'm not seeing a strong return on investment, it's really difficult to justify this upfront capital expense. But these capital improvements also tend to have the greatest energy efficiency potential. And then on the flip side, if I'm a tenant, I don't have an incentive to invest in a space because I don't own it. I might only be in a space for a couple of years, so my ROI is also not very compelling. And this mismatch leads to a stalemate where neither party is willing to invest in these efficiency measures. And that's called the split incentive. And the split incentive has been a problem forever. It's part of how a traditional lease is structured. Plus, with a typical leasing process, it can be very adversarial. How much can I get and how little can I give? So combined, the split incentive and this combative leasing process, these are challenges to overcome in order to comply with Local Law 97, because ultimately the landlord and tenant need to work together to take meaningful decarbonization action at the building level. So this is where the green lease comes in. A green lease is designed to create a collaborative agreement between landlords and tenants and remove that split incentive barrier. And it does this by including language that aligns the cost and benefits of efficiency investments for both parties. So it is a different concept than a traditional lease negotiation. And because we're removing that split incentive, green leases can foster sustainability success. So in addition to supporting compliance with regulations like Local Law 97, it gives you a route to engage with landlords or tenants, depending on which party you are. But it's a method of engagement to talk about your building's performance and to talk about these goals from the very beginning of your partnership. As a landlord, having a green lease shows tenants that you're willing to work with them to create the low carbon space that they want and need. So a study from JLL as of last year shows that demand for low carbon workspaces is actually set to outstrip supply across major markets by 2030. Having green lease also helps reduce utility costs. So based on research from IMT last year, a green lease can enable about 17% in energy savings for an average US office. And there are also many other potential successes when the landlord and tenant actively come together to align goals for the building and to foster these win-win outcomes. So in the context of Local Law 97, green leases should be a tool to set up your building for compliance. It's an avenue of engagement. It clarifies expectations and responsibilities of both parties and ultimately enables the building level decarbonization action and reporting information that you need. So a green lease typically has these clauses that address the following parameters. It outlines the priorities of both parties, prioritizes environmental health and wellness, establishes a point of contact, defines how building and tenant spaces will operate, and enables this ability to report progress, meaning utility data information is flowing between the two parties as needed. So these clauses together are meant to enable action because both parties have the information they need to make decisions to improve efficiency, and both parties have a way to connect with each other to talk about sustainability issues. So to be clear, a green lease isn't you sign it and you forget it. It sets up the partnership between a landlord and tenant so that you have an avenue to come back together over the lifetime of the lease to work on these overarching decarbonization goals. So here's an example of 4 basic but key topics that should be in every standard lease form and that view from each side. So both parties sharing a point of contact. It might seem basic, but having the right contact enables these sustainability conversations. If you don't have the right contact, then the conversation can't even get off the ground. Energy efficiency CapEx, we also call this the cost recovery clause. And this is what tackles the split incentive problem I mentioned earlier. And with this language, both parties are able to share in the benefits of efficiency investment at the building. And there are a variety of ways to address this and word this clause depending on your particular situation. Submetering. So this allows for measuring and data transparency. It can be a more difficult one to achieve, but if there's a way to get this, we strongly recommend it. And data transparency. It's all about the sharing. So tenant shares data with the landlord, enabling the landlord to aggregate the data to get a whole building view of energy performance, and can then share that whole building performance back with the tenant so that they understand how they're performing in the context of the building. So I know I'm preaching to the choir, but this data is foundational for creating these decarbonization goals and understanding progress towards goals. And especially in light of Local Law 97, you need the data, and the green lease is one way to get that data. So green leasing itself is not new. It's been around for over a decade and it's evolved over time. It went from being a check the box type exercise focused on office spaces and to then including additional property types like residential, industrial, and fostering continuing conversations between landlord and tenant. But where are we right now? We are on our way, if not already at, green leasing 2.0. So at IMT, we call this performance-based leasing. Our friends at Urban Land Institute call this net zero leasing. JLL calls this green leasing 2.0. But despite the different names, it's all the same concept. So with this type of lease, it's much more collaborative than ever and incorporates specific building targets, which is key in setting up a building for success with local law 97 compliance. It also defines accountability between landlord and tenant and has methods for addressing ongoing performance monitoring and remedies if either party fails to meet the responsibilities outlined in the lease. So on the IMT website, we have a page on performance-based leasing, including a document of sample lease clauses and a model performance-based lease. And I have that linked in the presentation here. But where else can you go to find out more information about green leasing and performance-based leases? Green Lease Leaders. So this is the program that I run. It was started in 2014 by IMT and the Department of Energy's Better Buildings Initiative. And Green Lease Leaders sets the standard for green leasing best practices. We provide technical support, so we have lots of publicly available free resources online. So that includes case studies, example lease clauses, and other materials. We also speak at conferences, webinars, engage with folks like y'all to increase awareness and knowledge about green leases. But we're most well known for our recognition program. So every year we open up an application process where organizations can submit their leases for recognition. Having Green Lease Leaders demonstrates that your leases follow industry best practices and that you're willing to be a partner to achieve ESG goals. We provide multiple levels of recognition from silver to gold to platinum, our highest level of achievement. And through that, we're providing companies with a roadmap for continued green lease improvement and enhancement over time. And with Green Lease Leaders, we're constantly evolving the program to make sure it remains relevant. So we're constantly creating new resources, updating requirements for Green Lease Leaders recognition so that we are providing value and still addressing the needs of the industry. So as of our 2024 cohort of winners, Green Lease Leaders covers over 8.1 billion square feet and includes a range of property types from offices, residential, healthcare, and more. We recognize landlords and tenants, and our Green Lease Leaders companies cover a wide geography. So many are based in the US, but we also have Green Lease Leaders from Canada, Mexico, the UK, Australia, and more. And we are currently preparing for the 2025 recognition cycle. So we're actually launching the application portal next week. So if your company utilizes green leases, please check us out and apply. I also want to highlight a few resources. So on the Green Lease Leaders website, we have our landlord and tenant reference guides. And we use these reference guides as our rubric for evaluating submissions for Green Lease Leaders recognition. But you can also use these reference guides as a starting point for understanding what types of green lease clauses are out there, the intent behind including these green lease clauses in a lease, and example green lease language. And then I'm also linking out to that performance-based leasing resources that I mentioned a slide or two earlier. We have a model performance-based lease template, so it can give you a starting point for understanding how this could look for your particular situation. So I wanted to sum up with a few main takeaways. Decarbonization at the building level is a team sport. And green leasing and performance-based leasing is all about supporting that collaboration and fostering win-win outcomes. And you need that performance-based lease to set up a building for success with local law 97. The time for a green lease is now. Leases can have a very long lifetime. So the leases you sign now have an impact on local law 97 compliance, but also if you have any 2030 or 2050 goals as well. You can utilize Green Lease Leaders to guide your green leasing journey. We have lots of resources available on our website, and we also offer green leasing consulting calls for organizations who want more customized assistance. And as you implement green leases, earn recognition for your work. You can apply for Green Lease Leaders recognition and use it to get more buy-in and demonstrate to your peers future tenants that your organization uses the lease to reduce the risk of noncompliance and also to create a more efficient building. Thank you so much. And then I just wanted to flag that I've linked out to a few additional resources and programs in the deck, which will be shared after today's webinar. And I'll pass it over to Phyllis.
Thank you so much, Diana. So I'm going to speak about the legal framework for green leasing, and Diana did actually go over a number of the points that I'm planning to make, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of more of a background about me. I'm of counsel in a firm called Greenbaum, Rose, Smith and Davis. We have offices in New York City and in New Jersey. And I have a pretty deep background in energy law generally, from starting with regulatory, but since electric deregulation, which happened in New York around in the late 90s, I've pretty much followed everything that's happened since then. And a lot of what I do now is helping buildings with projects that will enable them to comply with local law 97, so solar projects, energy efficiency projects, etc. But also we do leasing. So and I think that Diana gave a pretty good explanation about what is different about a green lease. It's important that it provides for sharing between the building owner and the individual tenant, because the tenants contribute a share of the building's carbon emissions, and also that the green lease can require tenant assistance to reduce the carbon output of the building. Because as Diana explained, otherwise, unless there is some sort of contract between the landlord and the tenant, there's not going to be a need on either side, absent either local law 97 or the individual needs of a tenant who might be interested in their sustainability profile, etc. There wouldn't be a need for either party to enter into this kind of lease. And the reason that it's very important that the tenant be involved is that, as probably everybody knows, tenant spaces comprise most of the buildings, so that gains in energy efficiency can't really be achieved without tenant cooperation.
Phyllis,
The
we're not seeing your slides progress. I don't know if you're on the.
I'm moving them, so
Okay, yeah, they're not moving on my screen. I don't know if anyone else is experiencing that as well.
you're still not seeing them?
I'm not, I don't know if anyone else is seeing them move. No. Okay. Can you put it on, start the presentation from the current slide? Because I'm seeing the sidebar as well as the main slide.
Oh, and I'm not.
You may need to do switch the display screen. It just may want to go over to the other one.
Hang on, let me see if I can. I don't actually know how to. I'm sorry.
That's all right. You could maybe move the slides forward from the one slide that you're on at the bottom. If you hover over the bottom left corner, should be an arrow that will,
I see.
yeah, try that.
I have to go back up. Not seeing that, that's not helping.
Okay, well, that's okay. Just, you can go ahead. We will listen. and-
I'm very sorry.
Oh, no, no
Um,
worries. We'll get the slides following the presentation. So,
Okay,
right.
all right. Unfortunately, I think let's see where I was. Okay. I'm going to try one more thing. Let me see. How about if I stop sharing and start again, try to start again?
That should work. Give that a
Let me,
shot.
let me try that.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, let me try to do it. Let me see if that'll work. Can you now see the differences from traditional lease?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay. So, um, basically one of the reasons for, with green leases providing for sharing of capital improvements, and other measures to reduce the carbon output, one of the concerns is that these costs are ongoing. And, again, as Diana, stated before, they're likely to increase every 5 years as the local law 97 criteria for energy efficiency become more stringent. But on the other hand, the green lease can also provide a formula for sharing of any cost savings between the tenant and the building owner, which result from the owner investing in energy efficiency measures and greener energy supply. Now, are you able to see the change in the slide? Okay, well, I just changed the slide.
Okay,
You-
yeah, we're still on
You're
different.
we're not seeing the presentation screen. If you go back to where the sidebar is and you just pop through those, we can see that screen.
Okay, I will, then I will do that. Let me, I'll do it again, stop sharing and share again with that. Oh, does not switch as readily.
Yeah, I'm not sure why it's not. I see you trying to click on like slide 4 and it's not
Yeah, I
advancing.
don't know why it's doing that. It's not.
There
Okay,
you go. You did it.
okay. So, under the green lease, one of the main areas of, I would say, of discussion, and probably one of the more important areas is the operating expense clause. In a traditional lease, the operating expense clause took into account, changes in building operating expenses and, that occurred from year to year, but normally wouldn't include capital expenses. But since, I think we now understand that you can't have energy efficiency improvements without making capital investments. So therefore, in order to make this work in a green lease, we need to include the capital costs that are associated both with energy efficiency measures and other things that in order to meet the requirements of local law 97. Now, submetering is actually required by an earlier local law for buildings that don't have direct metering for tenant space, which would be direct metering by the utility. But that doesn't mean that everybody has actually complied with that law, so therefore, sub-metering is something that should be addressed in the lease, and I will actually get to a little bit more about that in a further slide. The carbon emissions are which are regulated by Local Law 97, include those that are related to heating, cooling, and otherwise ventilating the building, and as well as the use of water and sewer and common area HVAC lighting and water use. So that needs to be included as well. And so what I did here is I actually put a reference to the Institute for Market Transitions model lease, because I thought that that model lease was very helpful in addressing the various provisions that you might need to be negotiating and have either different or additional lease language to what a traditional lease would show. And in that lease, there's also a provision that, or a clause in the lease that would provide for inclusion of capital costs, but that inclusion would also require the building owner to spread those costs over the useful life of the capital improvement. And tenants might also seek to cap the increases on those types of costs. Some other provisions that could be included in a green lease would be a sharing of Local Law 97 penalties. And while I didn't write a lot on this slide, I would say that that's an area that can be quite contentious and something that I think I expect that Lauren and Emily will address. One of the other things, and importantly, are building performance standards. Building performance standards address building-wide requirements that would be established by the building owner for the entire building. And for the most part, those will not be negotiable by the individual tenant unless there's something specific, and then that might be a carve-out that would be included in the terms of the green lease itself. The building performance standards would set forth operational maintenance and construction standards, and as well as any modifications to them that would be established from time to time by the building owner. And these would normally be a schedule or an exhibit or an addendum to the lease agreement itself. And another clause that I thought was could be interesting to address is the lease term, and that's because in many leases there's I see a tension, or particularly a tension for the building owner, in the length of the term as against the timing of the imposition of additional Local Law 97 requirements. And very often the landlord would like to have a longer lease, let's say 10 years or even maybe 20 years, but the Local Law 97 costs are changing it potentially every 5 years. So one of the questions is, how do you best address those types of that type of tension between the length of in the length of the lease? Turning to the electric clause, the electric clause may limit the amount of connected load that the tenant can connect in its own space to a specific number of watts that would be specified in the green lease. It would also specify, that there will be a sub-meter. Normally, I would expect the sub-meter to be provided by the building owner, and that would measure both demand and energy usage. If Importantly, I would say if the building owner supplies renewable energy to the building at the building site, whether the building owner owns it, the renewable energy project itself, or whether there's a third-party owner, the building owner may want to require the tenant to purchase the renewable energy from it at a specified rate. That rate would need to be specified in the lease itself. The building owner also should provide an annual summary of electric usage in the building common areas to the tenant, as well as providing the energy score for the building, if that's something that the tenant wants to be able to see. And I'll say that, there are a lot of tenants, larger tenants especially today, who are very concerned about their impact, their carbon impact. And sometimes that's because they have products that, where their buyers are concerned about their carbon impact. But another area that would be included in the provisions of the green lease could relate to tenant improvements in the lease space, and tenants would be required to comply with building performance standards, as well as their energy consumption limit, the plug load standard in the lease, and premises design criteria. The building owner would also have additional obligations in this regard that might include installation of a real-time system, a real-time energy system, which would be the basis for providing additional data that the tenant wants to see related to the building HVAC system. And they may be obliged to make changes in the tenant space to meet the required standards of the building if the building owner has failed to meet deadlines for comments to tenants' construction drawings. Hopefully that wouldn't happen, but there's a give and take between the tenant and the building owner, and if the building owner is required by the lease to provide its construction drawings to the building owner, then there's got to be a proper response to that. Another area that can be important in the leasing is a requirement for recommissioning within the building or within the tenant space. And that is so that the building is kept up to the standard that was set out actually in the lease, and to the extent that the lease is longer than 5 years, recommissioning most likely would be required as well to meet the updated and more stringent local law 97 requirements. So in summary, I think it's going to be very necessary for the landlord and the tenants to cooperate, and therefore using an updated lease form that takes into account some of these additional areas that I've spoke about is going to be very important. So thank you very much, and I will turn it over to Lisa and Emily.
Thanks, Phyllis. All right, so now we're going to move into a discussion that Lauren and Emily will conduct about their experiences implementing green leases and how they got into it, how it's working, how they're addressing challenges and opportunities. And again, please put questions into the Q&A. We'll field them as we can. I'll read them off, if you all aren't seeing them, so we can kind of keep the conversation lively. So Emily and Lauren, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, and thanks everybody for joining. My name is Emily Kildo, Vice President, Director of Sustainability here at SL Green. The company has been doing at least a form of green leasing for, over a decade, probably longer if you just call it by a different name. But more formally, we've been pursuing the Green Lease Leaders program. We were gold certified from 2020 to 2023, and now we're platinum. My position is very much focused as ESG writ large, but there are touch points in every asset. I would say one of the things that Diana had mentioned, that this is a team sport, her team event, is the probably biggest takeaway. The green lease is one piece of a lot of kind of components to make some of these things come to fruition. I'm going to pass it to Lauren before we get into the details. I think her and I have a fairly similar experience, but I think some nuances. So it might be good also to hear some of the questions to direct some of the conversation.
Sure. Thanks, Emily. So Lauren Moss, I'm the Senior Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer here at Vornado Realty Trust. We have a very similar portfolio to Emily, both primarily commercial office in New York City. I know there are a lot of questions floating around co-ops and condos, and we'll sort of in the residential market, I think we should talk, and then we can talk a little bit about that after. Vornado, also very similar to SL Green, has been doing some form of what I would call green leasing, really to address the split incentive and sub-metering for 10 years or so. We've been a green lease leader since last year was the first time we formally applied to the program, became a platinum green lease leader. And I do think the things I would take away from all the presentations you've heard is actually how many people are critical to the process. So Emily and I've talked about this a lot. It doesn't just sit with me or Emily. I do think there are moments where it's very helpful to have a point person in each organization on both sides that's responsible for sustainability, but that the leasing process in itself does not reside just in green, right? It resides as a much larger package. And so the idea of how to educate, integrate, and manage everybody who's participating on both sides is really important to ensure that you get to this, that you retain the things you need in the lease or in building regulations to ensure that we can continue to improve our buildings, meet building performance standards, et cetera. So Emily does, we just did this a few weeks ago, so I'm going to turn over to Emily to talk about process, I think.
Sure, absolutely. So I saw a question pop up regarding who pays the fines, and that is a complicated question full of calculations and processes and lease clauses, et cetera. Energy is a shared burden and also, expense to both the tenant and landlord side. So it starts with creating that agreement on the lease side. If a lease is an older lease, a lot of times it just sort of is a little bit vague. And so it's about figuring out the calculator. A lot of people are talking about square foot allocation. There are, I would say, more specific conversations around around focusing on energy use. So some of the things that Phyllis pointed out, the sub-metering pieces, real-time energy management, kind of having the structures built into the assets and looking for those types of facilities that can offer sort of the the actual energy use of your space so that you can equate it to who is paying for the energy and who is paying for the fines. So, you know, from a landlord's perspective, and this is probably something Lauren can talk about, there's a process, you kind of set up the process for how you pay the fines, but then it's about putting items within the lease to make sure that you're mitigating for those fines. The owner has a responsibility to make sure they're operating their properties as efficient as possibly, that they're doing the appropriate capital upgrades to maintain and to achieve, you know, as close to savings as possible. But we can only control so much as landlords. And so there is a responsibility on the tenancy side to be able to reduce as well. And so then that leads to a lot of work with the tenants to make sure that they understand that and having the right contacts and the right processes involved so that you can get to the actual in case of the tenant side reduction. So Lauren, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I do think, you know, local law 97 is very unique to New York City. Their building performance standards rolling out across this country, both locally, statewide, and they're every one of them is different. So when we talk local law 97, remember that like green leasing is broader than 97. Green leasing is not equal to local law 97, nor is it equal to retro commissioning or whatever happens in New York City. So when Diana talks about the Green Lease Leaders Program, it really is about creating an infrastructure for best practices in your lease to encompass a variety of things, including the fact that tenants come in with their own targets and goals, right? And so, you know, green leasing is a very broad topic. And I want to make sure people understand, because it's going to devolve into 97 because everybody's very anxious about that, which is very appropriate. But like green leasing is much broader than that. 97 is one component. So in New York City, working with REBNY not many years ago, but a couple of years ago, the owners and REBNY came up with a sort of standard approach to lease language for local law 97. It is in addition to the split incentive language. It is in addition to the sub-metering language. It is in addition to sort of high performance space fit outs, et cetera. It is specifically around 97. And from a commercial office standpoint, what it does is it partners the requirement around sub-metering that most tenants have in New York City with saying you, as a tenant, have an allocation of emissions based on the law in New York City. That is then, that allocation can be calculated by your square footage and the type of space, use type you are in that building. So we can tell you how much emissions you're allowed in a space. We then can calculate how much you're actually using by your sub-meter, which is your electric use, like in your own home. When you turn on a light, you use a kilowatt hour, right? That's what sub-meters are doing. They're capturing that plug load, the lighting, any supplemental equipment you might have. And then there's your proportionate share of the base building, right? Based on the size of the tenant. And then if you have overtime, HVAC needs, et cetera, we allocate to you, which is a very common commercial office practice, which happens through the CAM or the annually, we allocate costs to tenants based on sort of common area metering and usage. So 97 becomes a compilation of those two components, right? Your sub-meter use and your allocated use based on square footage. And then if that is over your emissions limit, look, if the building is under and not fined, you shouldn't really see a fine then, right? Like the owner is not going to fine you if the building isn't getting a fine. It's about at that point saying, well, the building is over. There are certain tenants that are more responsible potentially. Everything else may be, it may be that every tenant in the building participates in getting it over, or maybe the two. And the two that are using more than what the city has defined as appropriate for the type of space they have in the building they're in will have to sort of shoulder that per the lease language. What I also will say that Emily and I know is that we start every single conversation in every single New York City lease with this perfect language around local law 97, right? And then tenants come in and have conversations, because what tenants, like any, even if you're buying your own home, what you wouldn't want is to say, wait, in 4 years, I could be fined some huge amount of money that I have no idea about. I don't know that I can do that, right? Like if your mortgage went from $100 a month to $1,000 a month, you would have a concern, or your maintenance, or whatever it is, you would be concerned. So what we say then is we can sort of calculate out what the fines might be over the next 15 years and cap those fines potentially and say, as a tenant, if you go over and the building is looking like it's going over, we're going to give you some range so you can appropriately plan for it. At the same time, we're going to do everything in our power, and you're going to do everything in your power. That includes recs, that includes offsets, that includes base building upgrades, that includes tenant space, all of those things to ensure that the building doesn't get fined, right? Like, we're worst case scenario. But that's where the green lease helps, because if you have resolved the split incentive problem, owners are interested then in making capital investments. Tenants are interested then because they're seeing operational savings and reduced potential fines. So it's sort of a really nice marriage of sorts, and keeps us all working together towards what we all want to do, which is actually happy and efficient operating buildings. And now I think for Emily, it'd be interesting to hear what's been going on in terms of, how you see the leasing going, where you see leasing versus building regulations. This is where we debate all the time.
Emily looks like she might be frozen.
Yeah,
Um,
I'll go a little into the regulations piece.
okay.
I'm happy to do while she, which is, leasing is great. Leases are really, really thick and big, and they encompass a lot of things. What we have found in a review of all the things that we do at Vornado to partner with our tenants is that the lease is not necessarily the place for every single thing. It is the place for the 97 clause because it is a legal component. It is the place for the split incentive because, again, that has to do with payments, etc. But there are places that we put the building regulations in place where, in our building regulations, where we put things around, we would like the tenants to really think through how they fit out their space. Because I always say, like, it's like in your house, you set it and forget it, right? You renovate your house, you're good for 15 years. We want them to then renovate or build out their space to be efficient in 15 years, as much as we can understand that today, so that it is a high performance space for today, but that in 10 years, it still maintains the integrity and helps support this progress towards efficiency, compliance with fines, etc. So we've been sort of working through what goes in the lease and what goes in the building regs. And the other thing I always make a play for, and Diana knows this, she's heard me say it, is one of the things that changed our world was putting a sustainability contact in the lease. Because it means not that anybody calls me, but it means I can call them. And it means when we're doing tenant outreach around fit outs, around waste engagement, around local law 97, et cetera, we have a person that we can talk to, as opposed to trying to figure out through the property manager who that right person might be. I think the challenge, I would say, with co-ops and condos, they don't technically sign leases, right? Like, as a co-op owner, you're buying a percentage of the building. As a condo, you're buying a portion, your portion. Those are different kinds of structures where you're all, as a whole, responsible for the performance of the building and that assessment that comes for not complying. Rental buildings is also interesting because typically in the rental building, the heat is provided by the owner. It may not be, but there's either heat provided by the owner, typically air conditioning is not, or if it's a shared unit, meaning it provides both heating and cooling, typically the owner submeter the rental tenant and send them the bill. So they do have that submeter data. Co-ops and condos also have submeter data typically because they then bill their tenants for the electric load, not necessarily the heat, but any electric load in your space. I don't know if you want to get into residential space breaking down like commercial space, because that seems to be really, really granular. And you can put in better standards around the types of air conditioning units, et cetera. If you can do a building upgrade, there's a lot of resources for the multifamily market. But just to understand that a residential lease is very different than a commercial lease. And also commercial leases are for 10 to 15 years, or residential leases are for a year or two, maybe.
All right, good. Looks like Emily made it back. So welcome back, Emily. Lauren was holding up her end of the conversation. So Lauren, I think you were going to pitch something over to Emily. And if we need to kind of focus on maybe a shift to how tenants are actually responding, incorporating, you know, how are they playing, you know, in the field here.
Sorry, was that a pitch to me?
Yes.
I'm so sorry
and
for that.
That's okay. I didn't make it clear, but we'll start with you, and then we can bounce that question also back to Lauren.
Okay, so the answer is again, it's not a straightforward answer because it really depends on the tenant. You know, it is like anything else. You have somebody who comes in on the early stages and is asking questions about it. Typically, those negotiations go a lot more smoothly because you're having the discussion starting at the term sheet, and you're kind of starting with something and then building it out over time. Tenants that have corporate offices that are interested in it but aren't really necessarily thinking about it at the local level, that ends up becoming, you know, a little bit more maybe contentious at the conversations. And I think contentious is probably too strong of a word, but people who understand what local law 97 is and what these performance requirements do, they already have their own language. And so then it's a negotiation about how we kind of meld those two pieces together. And then, you know, on the total flip side, you have people that aren't even considering it or have just been told that they should try to say that they don't want any fines, which is not a reasonable, you know, sort of response to that. So, you know, then it's about educating, you know, whoever's negotiating those leases and kind of explain how this is about an equitable sharing of whatever impact happens specific to what your kind of your use is contributing from a carbon emission standpoint.
Lauren, anything to add?
No. I'm gonna say I see one question around supermarkets, which is interesting. We have a shopping mall out in Queens that we're working with right now. And it's actually like there are a few moments where I feel like all the like stars aligned here. But we have a shopping mall. It's not super old, but it's old enough. We have a very large supermarket that we are moving from one shopping mall into the other. We realized that when we moved, we're sort of consolidating. When we consolidated into this very large shopping mall, we didn't have enough capacity with the rooftop units that we had. And that we noticed that some of them were 10 years old or so at end of life. And so it was the opportunity, actually, two things. One is to work with the large scale supermarket to determine their interest in solar, because they have a larger footprint than just the store we're in, and that commitment to solar and a long-term lease with us. So it made sense. And the second is that we started to put in some heat pumps, like electric heat pump solutions into the mall because we had space on the roof. And that actually meant that we get the beneficial electrification credit in local law 97, plus we get the incentives from Con Ed or NYSERDA, and then we're working on this other solar project with them. So it was literally like the opportunity to say to the supermarket, hey, look, we can do this one thing for you, but also like help us along the way. The hard part with retail is typically they have a very set CAM, meaning that we don't assess them every year and allocate sort of their appropriate amount. There's a history more in retail of just setting your CAM at a certain square footage, which actually disincentivizes both parties, right? From any investment in the space over time. But this was a moment at which we were sort of moving this building around. And so I think what we're able to do is actually get that fine in 2030 down to zero between all of these different pieces, not fully electrify the building, but like move it towards, and that's like the dream, right? I think Emily and I both feel this way, that sort of going from 0 to 100 in terms of full electrification is not financially feasible. It's logistically complicated, but this idea of how do you move along in the lease terms using leasing, using new tenants to make improvements is really the key to this. And it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. We're all trying to get to the same end. So how do we do that?
Yep. No, really good points. And again, I think everybody does realize we are not just going to flip the switch and electrify buildings, in a year or two. It's a process. It takes planning. It takes cooperation. One of the questions that came up too, and you've kind of already taken the dive in here, but do you see trends in green lease terms that might change based on asset type? So again, you're already talking about asset type. Emily, I don't know if you have any other asset types that, you're seeing different nuances or considerations that need to be factored in.
It's not about the asset types. There's conversations around use type. There's conversations, the residential side has not been as engaged. We don't have a whole lot of residential in our portfolio. That's a lot more kind of individualized because you can very much carve out the usage for those tenants, at least if they're on packaged units. So I think, the conversation will continue to evolve, but I don't think people have quite gotten to the nuances of the differences between the different asset types. There's definitely conversations around system types, and to Lauren's point, about the electrification conversation, people wanting to understand what the plans are, and many times not necessarily completely educated on the costs of those types of capital improvements or capital changes in some cases. So, I still think that there's a lot of conversations still kind of sitting at the education level to make sure we all understand where we are, where we think we're going to go, and making sure, at least from a landlord perspective, that we have a plan in place where we don't know everything that's going to happen. We don't know how the tenants are going to evolve, but what we do have control of is end of life of equipment, and we know how the cycle works. We look for incentives, and we're working with especially the high use tenants to figure out, is there a way to reduce their overall consumption to get us under the whole building under the cap? This is where that negotiation with maybe one of the users that has, a UPS that is just completely inefficient, and they for some reason can't get rid of. There's these little nuanced things that end up happening, and finding those issues to mitigate for kind of the problems that end up spinning out to every single tenant potentially.
Yeah, one other thing that keeps coming up in the chat are condos, co-ops, and rentals. We may want to pull Diana back up on the screen here, and she may want to talk to it. I know she's been answering some of those questions in the chat. And condos and co-ops are basically ownership types for buildings. So those co-op and condo boards are responsible for LL97 compliance. However, when you're getting into potential leased space, commercial space, those condo and co-op boards may need to be dealing with green leases for those tenants. Or Diana, you may want to also address just general residential tenant issues as well, or opportunities.
Thanks, Lisa. And so from the green lease leader side of things and what I've seen, we do see some trends for multifamily, and we do have different guidance for multifamily. And I'm saying multifamily specifically because we, from the green lease leader side of things, we have not broached condos or co-ops, but we will have guidance for multifamily residential buildings. So I think one of the biggest differences between what we're talking about now in today's presentation and what is applicable for multifamily is that for residential buildings, green lease leaders does not recommend the split incentive language or that cost recovery language, because that creates a whole slew of equity issues. So we are actually about to launch a specific resource for multifamily landlords that covers the recommended clauses for residential. So when it comes to green leases for residential properties, we see it more specifically more as like a tool for engagement with residents and an ability and a way for multifamily landlords to start educating residents about the sustainability of their space. And there's still a data sharing component to it, but the language itself is a little bit tweaked because of the situation for multifamily, specifically that there are some utilities that will provide aggregated data for the whole building. So it's just it's a different situation. And because of that, the lease clauses may be worded differently, but but the main point is that you can still use a green lease even if you have a residential building. It's just that the clauses will be slightly different.
Okay, great.
But the requirements for a condo building are still the same from a submission standpoint, so there still needs to be a single entity identifying that data, entering it into the portal. The fine negotiation piece, I would assume, at least in terms of more personal life, not SLG life, but it's about the co-op agreements and how those structures are built, and if there's costs associated from a state tax or fine, then I would assume that it would kind of, fall into the same category as that if there wasn't other specific language put in, which I think people are still trying to figure out. At least at my co-op, they are.
And you do need a registered design professional in
100%. Yeah.
You do need to have an engineer. I mean, it's sort of like, we all got used to the benchmarking law, then local law 87, which is energy auditing and retro commissioning, which needs a registered design professional as well. And so now we're working on 97. The portal is not, I know there's lots of questions. The portal is not live yet. The process is not live yet. Their city has been putting out sort of guidelines as they have them. I would say, if you're looking for some information on 97, Urban Green Council, Building Energy Exchange is a whole high performance tenant leasing guide that, does address building performance standards, because that's actually the big piece of what we're talking about, whether it's 97 or in some other locality. And so, yes, but I do think, the thing about co-ops and condos, and I live in a co-op in New York City, is the sophistication of property managers, right? It's typically different than in a commercial office building. You don't typically have a chief sustainability officer or vice president of sustainability in your co-op or condo. And so just the idea of awareness is lower. It doesn't mean it's different, it's just harder, right? And so there's sort of, that's been the challenge, I think, with local law 97. And, with the accelerator, doing all of the outreach. That's the idea is, how do you move that market, which is really the biggest market, forward?
Yeah,
I would add one other thing, which is that co-ops in particular have specific rules, and usually a lot of the changes that are going to be made have to be voted on by the board of directors and sometimes by the building. So as I understand it, you have to have a majority of shareholders if you want to do submetering. So things like that. It's just important to know that there are different rules that apply to co-ops and condos.
absolutely.
Yeah, and I will venture to guess that over time, the Public Service Commission will get involved with how information is passed through Con Edison so that there's more visibility. There's already conversations about that from a tenant perspective. I know as there's a direct meter in our building and there's multiple tenants of the same rate class, I don't know who's using what. So there's ways to do pulse reads and other mirror meters to kind of glean that information. And I anticipate that will become a more robust conversation in the Public Service Commission.
Question.
Yes.
For 97. And, we don't know what for creating and filing, because the portal is not live. There has been guidance that you potentially would need floor plans and stacking plans so that you can both validate the square footage and also the use type if you're if you have a building with multiple use types. You will also need your local law 84 benchmarking. So it's a good practice to look at sort of how you've been using Energy Star Portfolio Manager, because that's going to be the sort of origin of utility data, right? Whatever process it goes into in the DOB. And so, you know, and to get on board and registered design professional now, because otherwise, I mean, Emily and I also were talking about this last week, like you need, I don't even remember what the deadline is, but you need a registered.
February 1st.
Oh, February 1st. If you're
Yeah.
going to ask for an extension, you're going to need a registered design professional. And I would also, the one thing that like in the laws is they won't fine you for 60 days after. So the deadline is May 1st, but technically you have until July 1st before you would have a fine for non-compliance or non-submission. But if you want to ask for an actual extension, you need a registered design professional.
And just, so I think a nuance that I spun a lot about, definitely check your Energy Star Portfolio Manager and make sure that the actual utility data aligns. But the use cases for 97 do not have to be an Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So they can be different, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but it's not worth the effort of trying to update the Energy Star Portfolio Manager to match the 97 profiles.
Right, you're gonna have to do it in the portal anyhow.
Right.
You're gonna have to repeat it.
Yeah, don't do it twice.
Don't do it twice, if you haven't done it already, right? Like if you haven't been doing it to measure compliance, some of us have already been doing it, right? I've broken down every single tenant by use type in order to maximize the emissions and ensure that we're in compliance, et cetera. But if you haven't already done that, you don't need to do that.
In
And
Energy Star.
Yeah, and just again to emphasize, you know, your starting point is so important. So your gross floor area measurements are vital, that they're accurate, and your energy use data. So sometimes, you know, things don't get put into Energy Star portfolio correctly. Certain data may be omitted. So again, that is really where you need to start to validate the base information is correct, because that's what your calculation for penalties is based on. Can't emphasize that enough. Yep.
And just because it came into Energy Star through Con Edison does not always mean it's 100% accurate. So check your bills, make sure that everything makes sense. Sometimes there will be an old account that's still getting pushed, and you'll, you know, sometimes double your energy use.
There are going to be nuances when you move the Energy Star into the portal where you're going to be selecting the meters. So if buildings with multiple meters, one of the things that I think is actually really important is to educate yourself on the meters in your building and which ones you're going to be moving over to local law 97. And we're still trying to understand the sort of, if a meter goes out of service mid-year, how is that going to reflect in 97, et cetera. So there are going to be quirks that we can't adjust for right now. We can't exactly know, but you know, I think there are going to be a lot of questions. The DOB seems to understand there are going to be a lot of questions, and good work to answer them and fill them out. There's a question around amortization of costs over the useful life of the asset. So, you know, it's based on the rent, like it's based on the lease term and the operational savings that we can see. And so we don't necessarily, we aren't necessarily able to amortize the full cost of an HVAC upgrade over a 5-year lease, because the next tenant will also see savings. So there are quirks in how you work out this amortization based on sort of the language in the lease and the savings the tenant sees. And that's why we do, and I'm sure Emily does also, these sort of annual CAM allocations that the tenants then audit to ensure that we are appropriately allocating costs to them, and any of the upgrades and improvements as well.
The law took effect, that was a question in the chat, in January 1st, 2024, technically. So we are already a year in, and then the submission date, as Lauren mentioned, was May 1st, that 60 days.
See trends in green lease terms that might change based on asset type. Does industrial have a specific term? So I will say, I think actually there's gonna be a change with all these building performance standards in retail leasing. triple net is a thing people talk about all the time where like we have no say and it's all on the tenant, but triple net, I would say there's not gonna be a change in that. It's responsibility of the whole leaseholder at that point to pay all fines, manage the equipment, make upgrades, etc. Retail, I think we're starting to see a slight shift, which is going away from that set cam. And where it makes sense in buildings where we have enough retail tenants and enough variability in the consumption, and they're driving past what might be the appropriate usage to build awareness around the retail tenants, that they should be looking at consumption and that there will be fines allocated to them. Because if you have a set cam, it's very hard to then one, make an improvement in the building, or two, allocate any of the fines to them. So I do think with the sort of proliferation of building performance standards across the country, we'll see a different awareness around retail leasing than we have right now.
There was a question about industrial. So,
Does industrial have a specific term that might stand out?
there's different qualifications. The use types are not just industrial. There's any kind of industrial use you can think of would have a qualification. So I think it's more nuanced than that, if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Just in a green lease.
Oh,
not
and
just in green leasing, but industrial also, like you see data centers, you see warehouses, refrigerated warehouses, non-refrigerated warehouses, triple net lease, like think about the sort of last mile warehouses where there may be multi-tenant, like industrial is a beast of its own when it comes to leasing. And it's like talking through co-ops, condos, and rentals. Like every different type is going to have a different kind of approach based on the type of lease that's in place. I don't know, Emily, if you would have something else.
yeah, no, that's the same. It's all more nuanced than just the categories. I think you have to think about it specifically for whatever the action is and the systems are.
I'm just trying to make sure all the questions, it looks like a lot of them have been answered in the chat or in the conversation. So I don't know if there are any additional key points or things that we haven't covered that you'd like to touch on, whether it be in tenant communication, ongoing, collaborations, maybe just talking about how you keep those conversations open and evolving and growing so that you can continue to improve the energy efficiency and decarbonization work in those buildings.
I think to reiterate the first points is that there's so many people who are involved in this, and so educating your counterpoints and making sure if you don't have access to certain people early stages in the lease, or if you have tenants rolling over, having the conversation to try to insert lease language when you're renegotiating as early as possible, and then having people in place throughout as connections and contacts so that you can have the conversations and try to make improvements over time.
I would just add, Emily's heard me say this, like we look at waste as the gateway drug to sustainability, but it is visible piece of sustainability in any building. So for us, a lot of our tenant engagement is around, and like a lot of the tenant conversations around sort of waste infrastructure that then allows us to sort of enter space in the tenant spaces and really then start to talk to them about their sub-meter usage. So we're trying it from every angle because they may not realize that they are not one of the best performers in the building. And the thing that I think the really simple message we give everybody is and I think I started this, like, you turn on your light at home, you pay the bill. If you turn it off, there's no kilowatt hours, so there's nothing to pay for. It's the same thing in a sub-metered building, right? Like in these office buildings where Emily and I spent all of our time, if the tenants use less, they pay less, so they save money. So it doesn't have to be around carbon emissions. It doesn't have to be about Local Law 97. It's about actually saving them dollars. I joke that then I save the carbon, but they save the dollars.
Is there any kind of transparency among tenants in the building where it can kind of, establish some peer-to-peer competitive behavior to see who's trending up or down, or have you done anything like that?
We do energy challenges, we do waste challenges.
Okay.
And they say it's amazing. We had one tenant save 12% in a month.
Wow. Wow.
Their consumption 12% month over month. So there is opportunity.
Yeah, the gamification is real.
Yes. Cool. All right. That's fun. I'm going to open it up to all the panelists for, kind of one final round of closing comments or takeaways that you'd like to share. So let's start with Diana.
I
Sorry,
just want to
putting you
say
on the spot here.
I just want to say thank you to all the panelists. It's been great to work with everybody, and I hope that everyone who's joined has found this useful. I think one main takeaway is that green leases, it's and to Lauren's earlier point, like green leases are a very broad category. So as a category and as a tool, green leases can be a tool for your properties, but it's the way in which you implement the lease that can have a lot of variability. And that's also part of the beauty of a green lease, that it can address the specific building level situation and the specific partnership between the landlord and tenant. So green leases are broad, but they have very targeted approach.
Thank you. Phyllis, closing thoughts for the audience.
Yes, well, thank you to everybody as well. But I would say, just in thinking about this, that what I'm hearing and what I'm thinking about is that this is a process that traditionally leasing has been a fairly adversarial process, and that we're entering a new paradigm, and that it's good for the tenant to start to think about this early, as Emily said, and maybe a lot earlier even than your lease requires you to think about it. And then to try to think about it as cooperation and what can I get and what's going to make life better for the people who work in my company. And possibly if I'm selling a product for my customer, and to look at it from that perspective and try to cooperate.
Great, thank you. Emily, closing comments, thoughts?
Yeah, no, thank you to everybody on the panel. As much as it seems like leasing is a boring conversation, somehow managed to be on multiple panels and conversations where it's completely different. I did see one question in the chat just about R&M, and this is, I'm going to segue into an actual real thought, but R&M is for us the most important thing to make sure that we're constantly keeping as operationally efficient as possible, and to make sure that the building is operating as best it can, so that when you're doing assessments on capital improvements, you know that it's not wasted energy or energy loss somewhere that you're factoring in, and basically not then making sure that you're spending the money efficiently. We do that through mostly NYSERDA programs and Con Ed NYSO programs. We pay for a lot of it through the demand response programs. We have on-site energy managers, real-time energy plus tenant. We really, really try to leverage as much incentive dollars to maximize the amount of R&M effort that goes into making sure that we're keeping as operationally efficient as possible.
Great points. And Lauren, last but not least.
I know I would agree with Emily that we've been having this conversation, but it's great to have. And I think, for me to build on everything that everybody's been saying, I do think it is still about ensuring that everybody on the team of negotiating, from the brokers to the tenants to the lawyers, understands that these are pieces of lease that should be retained. And that we want to make sure that we continue to build sort of awareness of the value of these leasing initiatives, and that they result both for the tenant and the owner in a better sort of product or better financial standing or more responsibility, whether or not we're looking at hitting sustainability goals, we're then, what Emily was talking about, like really running the best buildings possible on both sides of it.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Green leasing is going to be a huge and continuing topic as we venture further into LL97. So please feel free to reach out to us. We will help you navigate these waters, and hopefully today's discussion has been helpful. Thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.